Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Climate Tracker webinar on the South Asia competition. As you might have known, we're organizing a writing competition for people to join our workshop in Dhaka at the end of September. During this workshop, we will have personal training sessions, interactive sessions, webinars, lectures to make out of 20 people we've selected effective climate change communicators and effective climate change journalists. For you to win a spot on this workshop in Dhaka, you have to write an article on a specific topic, namely on the coal dissolution in Asia. And to help you write this article and get a bit of inspiration, we invited Dr. Huq. Welcome, Dr. Huq.
Thank you.
Dr. Huq is the director of ICCCAD, the International Center for Climate Change and Development, already since 2009. He's the senior fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development. And he's a lead author in many assessment reports and even wrote a chapter in one of the latest IPCC reports. So he's a very inspirational speaker. And so we're happy to have him on board and to help you inspire to write about climate change articles. Dr. Huq, the first question I'd like to ask you is that for our competition at the moment, we have asked young writers to write about a specific topic called the coal dissolution in South Asia. And for this purpose, I'd like to ask you, as a climate change specialist, if you could maybe describe the situation in Bangladesh and the coal reliance that is present in Bangladesh, and which effects this has on the environment in Bangladesh, on local communities, but also on climate change.
Sure. So very happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me. The situation in Bangladesh is that we have a very large population squeezed into a very small area. The population is more than 150 million people, and the area is less than 150,000 square kilometers. So the average density is more than 1,000 people per square kilometer, which is the definition of a city in the United Nations population statistics. And so it's a difficult terrain. We have to provide energy for industry, for urbanization, transport, houses, and for agriculture and irrigation. And traditionally, we have relied on fossil fuel-based electricity generation and distribution through grid electricity. We have not reached the grid electricity to everyone in the country or everywhere in the country. Recently, in the last few years, we have a very fast expanding solar home system program. These are rooftop solar PV panels that people buy at the household level, and they use it for lighting mainly at night. There's more than 4 million units that have been sold to households, with about 20 million people now having solar PV light. So it's one of the biggest, one of the biggest and fastest growing solar home system programs in the world. But at the same time, we have a fossil fuel reliant grid electricity generation and supply system, and which now is going into coal use in a big way. Firstly, by mining coal. We have coal deposits in part of the country in the north. There are plans for mining it. Some is already being mined, but larger mines are being planned. And then, in the south of the country, on the edge of the mangrove forest called the Sundarbans, which is the world's largest mangrove forest, in a place called Rampal, there is a new coal plant being developed, which is going to be based on imported coal. And this is a joint venture between Bangladesh and India. There's a lot of controversy around that. Many environmentalists, of whom I'm one, do not feel it's a good idea to invest in coal, both because coal is not the right thing to invest in, but secondly, the particular location of that plant in Rampal on the edge of the Sundarban is an environmentally sensitive area. It's a World Heritage Site, and is not a good location to have a coal power plant, which is going to be based on imported coal and have coal ships coming in all the time. So the situation is quite complex. The government's argument is that we have to give electricity to the people. We have to use whatever is available. If coal is the cheapest option, we have to do that. Our counter argument to that is it might be the cheapest option if you don't count the effects of pollution, and also you don't factor in the possibility that renewables will become even cheaper in future. So once you lock yourself into coal, particularly imported coal, you are locked into that particular technology for a long time to come. And so finally, I would say that there's an important decision that was made last conference of parties in Marrakesh, on the last day of the Marrakesh conference, by the group of climate vulnerable countries, a climate vulnerable forum. There are 48 countries, of which Bangladesh is one, that declared that they would all become 100% renewable by 2050, unilaterally, without asking for money or technology. They just said this is something they want to do because it's the right thing to do, and they're going to do it, and they want everybody else to follow us. That was a very powerful statement and pledge that the most vulnerable countries were taking the leadership in transitioning away from fossil fuels into renewable energy. The time span was 2050. That allows some decade or more of fossil fuel use, but eventually it means stopping fossil fuels and going to renewable 100%. And so Bangladesh position is somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, it is very strongly supporting renewables. It has a very good renewable program. On the other hand, it also promotes fossil fuels. And the last point I'll make is that there is a significant difference in the generation of our energy sector people, particularly the engineers working on energy generation. The older generation believe in building large fossil fuel powered generation plants and distributing it with large grid electricity. That's what they've been doing for decades. That's what they think they should do. They think they can continue to do that, and the future is the same as the past. But the younger generation who are coming out of the universities now and are seeing all the solar energy and renewable energy activities that are taking place, which are growing, still small, but growing very rapidly, are much more open to new ideas, open to challenging the old paradigms. And to a large extent, in my view, we will see a change in attitudes when we have a change in generations of our engineers and bureaucrats and technocrats and decision makers. The younger generation, I think, will be much more open to giving up on fossil fuels. The older generation are still stuck in the old paradigm.
That's a very hopeful message you gave there, Dr. Huq. I was just wondering, do you have any idea of what the percentage at the moment is of energy that is produced by coal power plants in Bangladesh? Do you have like an idea of if it's 80% of or 70%?
I don't know. I'm not an energy expert, but it's not that high. We are not a particularly large coal using power situation. It's mostly fossil fuel based furnace oil and petroleum, which we import and use for the energy sector. We have a hydro, we have a dam in the southern part of the country, southeastern part of the country, a place called Kaptai. I'm not sure how much it generates at the moment, in the region of maybe 10%. Renewable is growing, but it still as a percentage is quite small. It's only a few percent. But the large majority of the generation of electricity comes from furnace oil, from petroleum-based imports, not so much from coal. The new plants that are being built will actually increase the amount of coal being used.
Okay, that's an important message, actually. Okay, and also thank you for pointing out that the youth has to play an important role in the future. And that's also Climate Tracker's mission, to help empower the youth worldwide by organizing these journalism workshops, by building their capacity as journalists and as climate change communicators. And you yourself, Dr. Huq, are a big promoter of empowerment and of youth empowerment, but also capacity building in general. And you've written many articles and research papers on the need for capacity building in developed developing countries as a part of a climate resilience strategy. Could you maybe explain a little bit more why do you think it's really important to have capacity building going hand in hand with creating a climate resilience strategy for a developing country?
Sure. Well, I think capacity building and awareness of the climate change issue is needed in all countries, developed and developing. In developing countries, I think it's even more needed because we are going to be impacted by the impacts of climate change. We need to be aware of that. We need to know what to do about it. So there are a number of stages through which any country, any society, any group has to go through. Firstly, they have to become aware of the problem. To a very large extent, this is now, I would say, done. Most countries, people are aware of the problem. A few people might not accept it or have questions about it, but they're aware about the climate change problem. There's a very high degree of awareness everywhere. And in Bangladesh, particularly high degree. We were aware of the problem before anybody else was. So, we have a long history of knowing about this problem. And then, so we need to move from what I call phase one, which is raising awareness of the problem, to phase two, which is learning about solutions to the problem. And the difference between phase one, knowing about the problem, and phase two, learning about solutions, is several. Firstly, the problem is the same for everybody. Sea level rise, low-lying coasts, everywhere is going to have sea level rise. Cyclones and hurricanes, wherever they happen, they'll all happen. I get it. Floods and droughts, wherever they're used to it, these are not new things. They just become more acute with climate change. So they're not unfamiliar and they're well known. And wherever people are going to be affected by one, they know about it. So they know about the problem. But knowledge of solutions is not the same for everybody. I am an academic and a researcher. My knowledge is different from yours. A government official working in a Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Water or Energy has different responsibilities. A private sector person has a different responsibility. NGOs, youth, students, etc. Everybody, the solution is depending on who needs to be doing something. And not everybody has to do the same thing. And so that's where differentiation of different groups, and in your case, the climate trackers who are communicators, who want to share with other people, their job is to know about the solutions and then to communicate those solutions to other people. Their job is communicators. They have to understand it and then communicate it. So I would disaggregate what they need to learn in terms of solutions into two parts. One is at home in their own countries, what's happening, how are they going to be affected, what can they do about it? Is their government doing something about it? Is private sector doing something? Are NGOs doing something? Are communities doing something? If they are, learn about that and tell everybody else about it. So we need to tell people that people are doing things. They're not just sitting there, there's this problem, but we don't know what to do about it. Many people are doing things. So we need publicity and communication of actions to tackle the problem. People are actively trying to solve the problem in their own way. We need to find those stories, we need to disseminate those stories, we need to share those stories. The second group of activities are to do with following the global negotiations. This is a global problem. Part of the solution is going to come at the global level where countries come together and they make decisions to move forward faster or slower. They've agreed to move forward. Now the question is, how fast can we make them move forward? And this takes place at the annual conference of parties in November, December. This time it will be in Germany in November. 195 countries, governments will negotiate. And then there'll be many thousands of other people there talking about what to do. And so that global moment, when everybody is there, is something that many people will then be interested in. So one of the things with climate change as a story, it's a continuous story, but it's very difficult to put it in through the newspaper as a headline. Unless there's a flood or a cyclone, then it doesn't make a headline. But the annual event makes headlines. An annual event, everybody knows about it. So it's a good opportunity to tell people what's happening at that event. What does it mean for the audience that you're writing for back home? And so you connect the national with the global. So in a sense, the job of the communicator to me is to learn themselves, build their own capacity, to understand what's happening at the local level, understand what's happening at the national level and at the global level, and then communicate all three stories to the publics that they communicate with. whoever their public is. And in my institute, we do a lot of this. We work at community-based level with vulnerable communities. We work at the national level, not just in Bangladesh, but with other least developed countries. And in the negotiations at the COP, I'm an advisor to the group of least developed countries in the negotiations. And I advise them on the context and the text of the negotiations that they agree to at the global conferences.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Huq. That was a very thorough explanation on how capacity building is needed on many different levels, and how now we have to focus on communicating solutions, and awareness is well underway. And so solutions are the way to go in terms of communication, climate change. So incredibly interesting. One last question that is really your specialty and your passion, I think, as well. You've been an adaptation expert for many, many years, and you've been taking part of the CBAs, the community-based adaptation conferences, for many, many years. You have been to CBA 11, which was in Uganda very, very recently. Could you tell us maybe a little bit about it on a personal level? How was it, and what kind of important decisions are being made in these CBAs, in the community-based adaptation conferences, and which steps have been taken recently?
Sure. So let me give you a little potted history. I do a lot of work on adaptation, as you quite rightly said. I work with vulnerable communities and also with vulnerable countries. So the vulnerable countries are the least developed countries. They're 48 of the poorest countries in the world, mostly in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia, including my country, Bangladesh. That's a particular group in the negotiations. They negotiate as a bloc, as a group. So I help them there. I also help them at the national level in building their capacity to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and also work with very vulnerable communities on the ground. And a number of years ago, about 13 years ago, I started this series of annual conferences on community-based adaptation, where we would bring together people from around the world who are working with the most vulnerable communities. Initially, NGOs, development NGOs like Oxfam and CARE and ActionAid, who work with poor communities, who at that time did not know much about climate change. So they wanted to learn about how is climate change going to affect the poor people that they're already working with. And over time, we've had this as a series. The first three we held 2 years apart, and then it became an annual event. We hold it in different countries. Last year, we were in Bangladesh. Before that, we were in Kenya. Before that, in Nepal. This year, a few weeks ago in June, we held it in Kampala in Uganda. And this is the 11th international conference. We had about 300 people from about 50 countries from around the world. We now get a lot of people from government, particularly local government, who are also trying to do things with local communities, international aid agencies, researchers. So a much wider mix of people now attend these conferences and share what they're doing. It's mainly about sharing experience and learning from each other. The theme this year for this year's conference was on ecosystem-based adaptation. And one of the things we do at this conference is that we usually take all the international participants on a 3-day field visit prior to the conference. So they go in groups of about 20, and they spend 2 nights living with a vulnerable community that is facing climate change and is doing something about it. So they learn about community-based adaptation on the ground from the community. And then they come back to the capital city, and then we have a more traditional conference of presentations and sharing and so on. And so the theme of ecosystem-based adaptation is very relevant for Uganda and Eastern Africa in particular, because there's lots of different adaptation, local adaptations, community-based adaptations taking place in different ecosystems there. Mountain ecosystems, wetland ecosystems, dryland ecosystems. And it was very interesting for people to see the connection between what we traditionally work on, which is community-based adaptation, and the connection with ecosystems in which they live, because every community lives in an ecosystem. And so in a sense, we ended up the message being, well, you end up doing the same thing. You have to have a community-based and ecosystem-based adaptation. You might arrive at it from different directions. You may be working mainly in ecosystem-based adaptation, but then you have to work with communities, or you may be working with communities on community-based adaptation, but you have to take recognize the ecosystem within which they live and work in order for you to develop adaptation strategies. A wetland community is different from a dryland community, and they have to understand the ecosystem before they can come up with community-based solutions and adaptations. So it was a very interesting conference. We had a lot of discussions, as we always do, and we had a very interesting sharing of experience. There's a website where people can go to see presentations and posters if they're interested.
Could you maybe briefly give a few examples of community-based adaptations in Bangladesh that you are aware of or have worked with?
Bangladesh has been, yes, certainly. Bangladesh has been doing this for some time now. So we have some very, very good experiences. I'll mention three. The northeastern part of Bangladesh is a wetland. It gets flooded every year during the monsoon. Right now, it's completely underwater. And then when the monsoon is over, the water goes down slowly, and then the land comes up, and people can grow a crop of rice. So it's a part of the year, it's water and people fish, and then part of the year, the land comes up and people can grow some rice. And this is a traditional pattern. But what we are seeing now increasingly with climate change is the pattern is getting disrupted. And this year, the floods came very early, much earlier than they normally do, and the farmers who had a crop could not harvest the crop in time. So they lost their entire crop because we had a unseasonal flood. You know, this flood should have come a month later. It came a month early, which it hasn't happened for the last 20 years. So that's one of the impacts of climate change, that it makes weather patterns more erratic, more uncertain. And so it's difficult to plan. I mean, it's not new. We know this, but people are adapted to it. But the adaptation is to business as usual, not to a climate changed world. And climate change world means things are now different. The second one I'll mention is that we have in the coastal area, in addition to coastal flooding and rains and monsoons, we are now seeing significant amount of salinity increasing in the soil and in the water because of sea level rise. We have a very low-lying coast. We are the delta of two major rivers, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, very low-lying area. And gradually, with sea level rise, the saline zone, water is becoming more saline. It's people who have to live there are drinking it because they have no other option. They're using it for agriculture, but it's becoming more and more difficult. It's affecting people's health, particularly pregnant women who drink saline water are already being affected by hypertension, and then it leads to preeclampsia or problems with childbirth. So we are already seeing some of the impacts of climate change. And as a result, what is happening is there a big program by both the government and the NGOs in that area of providing fresh drinking water, in particular, helping households capture rainwater on the rooftops. So they capture the rainwater, put it in containers, and then during the dry season, which is the worst season for the salinity, they have some fresh water to drink. And they know to do that, and they're able to do that. So there are various kinds of local level adaptations that are taking place already in Bangladesh and around the world. There are many, many communities around the world are doing these. And what we try to do in the community-based adaptation conferences is learn from each other, share with each other, and see how we can enable many, many more millions of people to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, because we're seeing them now all over the world.
Well, those were three very strong examples, very acute situations as well, where something needs to be done very quickly, and adaptation is absolutely necessary there. Maybe to end up this amazing talk with you, this really nice interview, could you give a last, speech or explanation to our viewers, which are mainly young writers from South Asia, how they, or which issue they should tackle most urgently in their writings? So most of our viewers are young journalists, young writers, or people who are trying to write about climate change issues. For you, what are the main issues or the main issues in the news that need to be brought forward a bit more?
Absolutely. So my advice to young people who want to both learn more about climate change and communicate more about what they learn about climate change. And as I said, my advice is focus on solutions to the problem, not just describing the problem, but what can be done about it. Find people who are doing something, tell their stories. Those are very inspiring to hear people are doing something rather than sitting and being affected. That's all. Vulnerability is not a good story to tell people. It doesn't help. It just makes you feel pity. But giving an inspirational story of somebody who's vulnerable but doing something about it is much more inspiring. You think, that's something that can be done. Others can do that. People can learn from examples. So find solutions, report solutions. And secondly, as I understand it, you'll have a competition or a selection for people to come to the workshop in Bangladesh. So I hope everybody will participate in that competition and try to come. I would welcome all of them to Dhaka, Bangladesh. I hope I'm here. When they come, I'd like to show them what's happening here. And when they come to Bangladesh, I hope they get to go out and see things. There is much that is happening in this country. In many ways, I would say Bangladesh is leading the world in trying to come up with solutions. We haven't solved the problem, but we are trying many, many different things. And we are learning very fast on what works and what doesn't work. And so if these young people come from other countries or even from Bangladesh to the workshop that you're going to run here, I hope they have a chance to hear from people here and go and see some of the activities that they're doing. And hopefully that will inspire them when they go home to continue to tell the stories of tackling climate change. It is the overarching problem of our times, and for young people, their lives. There's no bigger problem than climate change, and no bigger cause than tackling climate change.
That was a beautiful ending speech. I think everybody who was watching is very inspired now to start writing straight away and to get their voices heard. Thank you so much, Dr. Huq. And we hope to hear more from you and keep doing the great work you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. Goodbye. Thank you.